So, what's it like to work in a dying industry? I know, most of you probably think the magazine industry is dying, yes? I'm here to tell you that it's not, and more importantly, our society depends on it more than ever. Magazines are a keystone species. Bear with me while I explain what that term is for those of us that don't have a construction background or haven't spent time taking kids through wetlands like I have. It actually gets its term from a construction term. So the keystone is the top of an archway. It has the least amount of pressure on it, but without it, the arch would collapse. A keystone species has a larger effect on its environment relative to its abundance or its numbers. A beaver is actually a perfect example of a keystone species. By building a dam, it creates a wetland and provides habitat to countless other organisms. In fact, some 50% of North America's endangered species rely on beaver wetlands. They're home to dragonflies and water lilies and frogs and warm water fish. It's just one beaver, but it creates an entire community. It's the glue that holds it all together. So why do we want something to act as a keystone species? I'm not literally talking about magazines building condos or affordable housing, though I'm sure there are magazines that beautifully analyze both. I'm talking about the connections that are formed that build real and lasting community and space for connection. And that's something magazines are particularly great at. In fact, magazines are uniquely positioned to be social connectors. There's a magazine innovation center in Mississippi, yes, Mississippi, and it tracks magazine launches and closures over time. And its director, Samir Husni, who also goes by the name Mr. Magazine, he notes that there are more magazines now than we've ever had in our entire lifetime. In 1980, there were 2,000. Now there are over 12,000. And in fact, a new magazine launches almost every day. And we need that more than ever. Just last year, researcher Julianne Holt-Lundstadt of Brigham Young University, she's a professor of psychology there, she released a report that demonstrated that loneliness and social isolation are some of the greatest public health risks of our time, far greater than obesity. She looked at big data of literally millions of people and tracked things like diet and smoking and doctor's visits, and after 7 years, determined what factors reduced our risk of dying the most. In fact, exercise and diet ranked much lower than the top two, which were close relationships and social integration. In fact, greater social connection is associated with a 50% reduced risk in early death. She also noted that the medical system should be including social connectedness in its medical screening, and that community planners should be encouraged to include spaces for social connection, places like community gardens. Connection boosts feel-good hormones, it reduces our cortisol levels. It's statistically shown that those with social connection are more likely to battle disease successfully. We're biologically programmed to want to be a part of something larger, to connect with others and be a part of a community. So how do beavers and social connectedness have anything to do with magazines? I know that the first instinct is to think of magazines and the reading of magazines as a very solitary experience. In fact, for a long time when magazine industry types were defending the relevance of magazines in the 21st century, they'd say, well, you can read a magazine in the bath, because you can't do that with a computer or an iPhone, right? But as I've said, new magazines are launching almost every day. And there's something that most of these magazines have in common, and that's that they're in celebration of unique communities and connection. There's a recent article in The Guardian that talked about the boom that's happening in London right now in publications. There's Mushpit, which is a magazine for young London women in the city, Burnt Roti, which is written by and for South Asian women, and Galdem, which is a culture magazine written by and for Black and minority women in the city. Even startups, supposedly the purveyor of digital-first connection, are entering into the print magazine field. There's Airbnb magazine, Facebook recently launched Grow, which is for business leaders, and Gwyneth Paltrow's Megaforce website, Goop, got into the print magazine field in late 2017. Part of the reason for this boom is that, like most businesses, technology has made it much easier for small but mighty teams to produce thoughtful content nimbly. We no longer need typesetters or stack cameras or paste-up boards or millions of dollars worth of equipment to execute one person's genius idea, whether it's to bring people of color together or Gwyneth Paltrow's fans. But I also believe it's no surprise in this time of supposed increased connectivity, we're on our phones and on social media all the time, that we're craving genuine connection with our modern families, and magazines provide this habitat for us. We're seeking an environment with others in a familiar space, whether it's a magazine like Intern, which was launched by young people who were fed up with their work experiences, or Hole in Corner, which is a magazine for those obsessed with luxury crafting. Magazines document our cultures and our subcultures. You can look at the content of magazines through the ages, whether it's Harper's in its early iteration in the 1850s when it was pirating fiction by Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters, to Us Weekly telling us that Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston are finally back together. These are the documents that show us how we lived and what we valued as important. It's no accident that Caitlyn Jenner chose a magazine, Vanity Fair, to reveal her new sense of self, her new identity, her new name. There's permanence, a record of who we are in these print pages. When I tell someone I work at Western Living magazine, they inevitably start by saying, "Oh, my mom loves that magazine." But then they go on to say that they grew up with it as well, that it was always part of their home, it was on the coffee table, it was part of their environment. Western Canadians identify very strongly with their Western Canadian geography. We're not Toronto. And the fact that there was a magazine that had created a space for them and an environment that celebrated what was theirs is the equivalent of a beaver creating a pond for frogs and minnows. In fact, some of the most successful magazine launches in recent years have focused around this idea of celebrating unique communities and connection. One of my favorites is the excellently titled Garden and Gun magazine, which is a celebration of the modern South, surprise, surprise. It launched in 2007 and very quickly recognized how much they'd connected with their readers, and in fact needed to create real spaces for their readers to connect with. So they've since launched Garden and Gun Club, which is a restaurant in Atlanta, and they have the Garden and Gun Society, which are family reunion-style events that happen all over the globe, from field dinners in Bermuda to cocktail brunches in Kentucky. Magazines create an environment that we want to live in both on the page, which is rich with imagery and text, and in real life, or IRL, as the kids say today. So the obvious conclusion to this is, what happens when a keystone species disappears? What happens when a magazine dies? When a beaver's dam is removed, it's more than the beaver that loses its home. If a riverside property or a new housing development means that it needs to go away, then more mobile creatures like songbirds and voles might be able to find another community, but those that are in the water are lost. And we grieve the loss of our keystone species of a magazine, this habitat builder, not because we loved reading Interview or Gourmet or Metropolitan Home in the Bath, but because of the environment it created and the communities we became a part of. They created a footprint for why we matter. Whether it's a story about giving us permission to abandon our smoothie-loving culture for a night of decadent French food in Vancouver magazine, or what it's like to suffer depression during Ramadan in Galdem. Magazines share the stories of our human experience. They validate us, and the ones that we love reflect who and what is important to us. Sure, we can get into details about how print triggers far greater emotional connection than digital. Studies show, for example, that if people really love an ebook, they'll go and purchase the physical copy of it to possess its physical being. But magazines, in essence, prove we ever existed at all. They provide an access point to others who believe in or belong to these cultures and subcultures that feed who we are as human beings. They trigger feel-good hormones that come from connection, those connections that battle the plague of social isolation and loneliness. The positive note is that we are a fighting species. When Gourmet was shuttered in 2008, Food Network magazine launched in its wake and captured those habitat-starved readers, and they still have 2 million readers today. Magazine readership is actually increasing by millions every year, and every year since 2008, more magazines have launched than closed. There are more than 190 print magazines that have survived for more than 50 years. There's only 15 TV programs that can say the same. Magazines are surviving because of the homes and the environments that they create for us. When someone tells me they grew up with Western Living magazine and it's been a part of their landscape for as long as they can remember, I know well what they mean. We crave connection to each other. Magazines provide us with a launch point to finding our modern tribes, to showing us a world where we are celebrated, where we are discovered, and where we are connected. They are where we live and where we find each other. Magazines are the keystone species that we need now more than ever. Thank you.